The garage smelled of old motor oil and the particular cold that settles into concrete after a long winter, and the Camaro sat in the middle of it like something the weather had finally finished with. Victoria Crane, CEO of Crane Automotive Group, looked at the car the way a person looks at a receipt for something they did not order. $400, she said, loudly enough for the camera crew and the small crowd gathered at the shop's open bay door to hear every syllable. That's what I'd give you for the scrap weight. What Victoria Crane did not know, what she could not have known, because Marcus Hale had not told anyone in Denton, was that the quiet man standing beside the car had spent 11 years restoring factory race cars for clients whose names appeared in the auction catalogs at Barrett Jackson and Mecum, that he had once rebuilt a 1969 ZL1 from a bare cowl tag to a running, documented machine, and that he had walked away from all of it on purpose. Beside Marcus, his 7-year-old daughter Lily stood with a stuffed rabbit pressed against her collarbone, watching Victoria Crane the way children watch fire. Marcus said nothing. What happened next would take 5 weeks, 5 separate discoveries, and 1 very public correction. The morning Marcus Hale moved back to Denton, Ohio, the sky was the color of old primer, and the moving truck smelled of cardboard and the particular staleness of a life packed in a hurry. He had not been in a hurry. He had been deliberate, the way a surgeon is deliberate when he chooses to stop operating. Claire had died in March, a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that afterward makes every Tuesday feel like a held breath. Lily was 4 then, small enough to still believe that her father's presence was the entire architecture of safety. He had looked at his restoration shop in Detroit, the lifts, the reference library, the climate-controlled paint booth, and understood that none of it was worth the risk of Lily losing a second parent to 60-hour weeks and the slow erosion of being somewhere else. He sold the Detroit shop to a collector from Scottsdale. He took a smaller space on the edge of Denton, a 2-bay garage with a gravel lot and a hand-painted sign that said, Hale's Auto. He did not advertise his history. He changed oil. He replaced brake pads. He kept the hours short enough that Lily could walk from school to the shop and sit on the wooden stool behind the counter and do her homework while he worked. The stuffed rabbit, which Lily called Biscuit, had been Claire's last gift to her, purchased from a hospital gift shop 3 days before the end. Lily carried it everywhere. Marcus had learned not to comment on this. Some objects are not for commentary. Ray Dominguez had been working for Marcus since the 2nd month. Ray was a retired fleet mechanic, 61 years old, with hands that looked like they had been cast from the same iron as the engines he spent his life inside. He was not a talker. He arrived at 7, left at 5, and had never once asked Marcus about Detroit. This was the quality Marcus valued most in him. The Camaro arrived on a Tuesday in late October, towed in from the estate sale of a man named Harold Pruitt, who had stored it in a barn outside Denton for 31 years. The body was surface oxidized to a deep amber rust across the hood and roof. The interior was mice and mildew. The engine bay was a decade of accumulated grime. But the car sat level on its suspension, and the frame rails, visible through the passenger side floor rot, were straight. Marcus looked at it for a long time without speaking. Ray stood beside him and did not speak either. Lily, sitting on her stool with biscuit in her lap, said, "It looks tired." Marcus said, "Yeah." He did not say what he had seen in the first 30 seconds of looking. He had seen the cow tag. He had seen the partial VIN stamping on the firewall. He had kept his face arranged into the expression of a man looking at a routine project. Victoria Crane arrived on a Thursday, 2 days later, with her COO, Derek Paulson, and a camera crew from a regional automotive television program that Crane Automotive Group sponsored. Crane was 54, dressed in the kind of casual wealth that requires considerable effort, and she had the manner of someone who had learned that arriving with a camera crew was its own form of leverage. Derek Paulson arrived first, moving through the bay with a clipboard and the practiced efficiency of a man who prepares the ground before the principal enters. He walked the length of the Camaro once, made 2 notes, and told Marcus, without preamble, that a car in this condition represented a net liability for any dealership that touched it. The restoration exposure alone, he said, would exceed any reasonable resale margin, and the absence of documentation made the whole thing uninsurable as a collectible. He said this quietly, without malice, the way a man delivers a verdict he considers self-evident. Then Crane came through the door. The public crowd gathered at the bay door was a consequence of the camera crew. People stopped for cameras. They stopped here. Crane walked around the Camaro once. She did not crouch to look at the frame rails. She did not open the hood. She looked at the surface the way a person reads a headline without the article. $400, she said, her voice carrying easily across the bay. That's what I give you for the scrap weight. Frankly, I'm being generous. Paulson nodded with the enthusiasm of a man confirming a diagnosis. Lily's grip on biscuit tightened. Marcus stood with his hands at his sides and said nothing, and the nothing he said had a particular quality to it, the kind of quiet that is not the absence of something, but the presence of a decision. He did not know that Victoria Crane had been buying and flipping barn-find muscle cars for 3 years, that she had a specialist on retainer, and that the specialist had not been present today. He did not know, and neither did she, that this particular absence would matter enormously. Ray watched from the corner of the bay with his arms folded and said nothing. The camera crew got their footage. Crane and Paulson left. The crowd dispersed. The garage returned to its smell of cold concrete and old oil. Marcus pulled a shop light from the hook on the wall, ran the cord to the outlet near the lift, and lay down on the creeper. He slid under the car. Ray watched him disappear beneath the rocker panel. 3 minutes passed. Then Marcus slid back out, stood up, and looked at Ray with an expression Ray had not seen on him before. "Get the camera," Marcus said. "The good one. From the cabinet." Ray got it. On day 3 of the documented restoration work, Marcus photographed the chassis stampings in sequence, each one under the shop light, each one logged in the spiral notebook he kept on the workbench, beside Claire's photograph and Lily's drawing of Biscuit. The stampings were original. They were consistent. They told a story that the surface rust had been telling all along, to anyone who knew the language. Don Yanko was 79 years old, the son of the man who had built the Copo Camaro program into a legend, and he had spent the better part of his adult life being asked to authenticate things. He drove to Denton on day 11, a Saturday, and arrived at Hale's Auto at 9 in the morning with a canvas bag and the unhurried manner of a man who has nothing left to prove. He spent 40 minutes with the chassis stampings, 20 minutes with the cowl tag, and another 10 minutes sitting in the driver's seat with the door open, saying nothing. Then he stood up, looked at Marcus, and said, "Where did you find this car?" Marcus told him about Harold Pruitt and the barn. Don Yanko nodded slowly, the way a person nods when a long-held suspicion resolves into fact. He opened his canvas bag, cross-referenced the VIN sequence against his own records, and confirmed in writing on his own letterhead that the chassis stampings were consistent with a 1969 Copo 9560 production unit, one of 69 ZL 1 option cars built that year. 69 cars total in the world. The door panel had been held in place by 2 original Phillips screws and 31 years of barn humidity, and when Marcus finally worked it free on day 4, the smell that came out was of voids paper and the particular dryness of something sealed against the world for a very long time. He set the panel on the workbench and looked at what was tucked behind it. A folded document, creased into quarters, printed on GM factory stock. He did not unfold it immediately. He set it under the shop light and looked at the edges first, the way he had been taught to look at things before touching them, the way his mentor in Detroit had told him that the first 30 seconds of looking are the ones you cannot get back. The document was a Copo build sheet, order number 9560, engine code ZL1, date of production, stamped in the lower right corner, February 1969. The options column listed the aluminum 427, the heavy-duty radiator, the special front springs, the deletion of the standard emissions equipment, every box filled, every line consistent. Marcus had learned to read factory documentation the way some people read music, not as a series of individual marks, but as a structure, a grammar, a set of relationships that either held together or did not. Claire had teased him about it with the warmth of someone who understood that his precision was also his tenderness. She dismissed it on day 7, publicly, at a dealer event Crane Automotive Group was hosting at the Denton Convention Center. Crane had brought her appraiser, a man named Jeffrey Stills, who wore a linen jacket and spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being the last word in a room. Jeffrey Stills held the build sheet for approximately 45 seconds. He set it on the table. "This is a reproduction," he said into the microphone, with the flat certainty of a man who has made this pronouncement before and found it useful. "The paper stock is inconsistent with factory issue. The font spacing on the options column is off. I've seen these before." He looked at the audience. "This is a common forgery type." The audience murmured. Crane, seated at the panel table, said nothing, but her expression was the expression of a person who has just been given a gift. Marcus stood at the edge of the room with Ray beside him. He did not respond. He looked at the build sheet on the table, and his face was the face of a man doing arithmetic. On day 9, Marcus and Ray drove to the GM Heritage Center in Sterling Heights. The archivist there, a woman named Patricia Cole, had worked with Marcus twice before in the Detroit years, and she received him with the quiet recognition of a colleague. She pulled the production records for the relevant VIN sequence and cross-referenced the order number against the surviving COPO documentation in the archive. The process took 4 hours. The records confirmed the build sheet, not approximately, but precisely. The font spacing Jeffrey Stills had identified as inconsistent was, Patricia Cole explained, specific to the Norwood, Ohio assembly plant's internal documentation format, a variation from the standard Fremont plant format that was well documented in the archive, but rarely known outside it. On day 12, Lily came to the shop after school and sat on her stool and watched Marcus organize the archive copies alongside the original build sheet. She held Biscuit in her lap and studied the papers for a while. Then she said, "Is that the car's birth certificate?" Marcus looked up. "Something like that," he said. "So it knows who it is?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It does now." Dr. Elaine Marsh was a historian at Ohio State who had published 2 peer-reviewed papers on GM's COPO production program and had been called as an expert witness in 3 automotive fraud cases. She drove to Denton on day 15, examined the build sheet alongside the GM Heritage Center copies, and produced a written authentication on university letterhead that addressed point by point every claim Jeffrey Stills had made at the dealer event. The paper stock was consistent with Norwood plant issue. The font spacing was consistent with Norwood's internal format. The order number was traceable. The document was genuine. The authentication was presented at a follow-up segment of the same regional showcase 2 weeks after Jeffrey Stills had dismissed the build sheet from the same table. Dr. Marsh read her findings aloud, steadily, without inflection, letting the weight of the evidence carry itself. Jeffrey Stills was not in the room. Victoria Crane was. When Dr. Marsh finished, Crane leaned toward the microphone and said, in a voice that was measured and lower than her usual register, "It appears our appraiser may have been working from incomplete information. The documentation appears to be exactly what Mr. Hale has represented it to be." She paused. I'd like to speak with Mr. Hale privately about the car's future. Marcus was standing at the back of the room. He picked up the authentication letter, folded it once, and set it in the notebook. I appreciate that, he said. I'm not looking for a partner. Lily, on her stool, scratched Biscuit's ear. Ray turned back to the engine he had been cleaning and said nothing at all. The transmission was buried under a quarter-inch of compacted grime that had the texture of old felt, and Marcus found it on day 2 of the drivetrain inspection, working his way through the bell housing and running his fingers along the case in the particular way he had learned to run his fingers along things he needed to understand before he could see them clearly. He had learned this from a transmission specialist in Detroit named Carl Foss, who had told him once that a gearbox will tell you everything it is if you ask it with your hands before you ask it with your eyes. Claire had called it his listening face, the expression he wore when he was running his hands along something he was trying to understand. She had photographed it once, without telling him, and the frame had moved with him from Detroit to Denton, and now sat on the shelf above the workbench beside the spiral notebook and Lily's drawing of Biscuit. What his hands told him on day 2 was that the case geometry was wrong for a standard M20 wide ratio unit. The shift tower position was off. The case casting is heavier. He did not say anything to Ray. He kept working. On day 3, he cleaned enough grime from the case to read the casting date and the partial identifier stamp. He sat back on the creeper and looked at the ceiling of the bay for a moment. Then he looked at Ray. M22, he said. Ray set down the rag he was holding. Close ratio? Close ratio, Marcus said. The M22 Rock Crusher was the heavy-duty close ratio 4-speed built for high torque applications. The transmission Chevrolet had specified for the ZL1 option because the standard unit could not survive the engine's output. Numbers matching M22 units in documented ZL1 cars were among the rarest drivetrain components in American muscle car history. The gearbox under Marcus's hands had been sitting in a barn for 31 years, doing so quietly, without announcing itself, the way rare things often do. Crane's dealership mechanic, a young man named Tyler, who had been sent to inspect the drivetrain on day 5, spent 11 minutes under the car and emerged with grease on his forearms and a verdict. He delivered it to Derek Paulson, who delivered it to Crane, who delivered it to the camera crew at the regional showcase the following Thursday. Paulson said it into the microphone with the practiced fluency of someone reading from a script he had approved himself. The drivetrain was seized and scrapped. The transmission was a non-original replacement unit, and the cost of making the car drivable would exceed any reasonable valuation of the vehicle. The crowd at the showcase listened. Several of them nodded. Marcus was not there. He was at the shop on day 8 of the transmission work with the M22 unit on the bench and Ray across from him. And the two of them were measuring. The work was methodical in the way that only work done by someone who has done it before can be methodical. Marcus disassembled the unit in sequence, photographing each component before removal, logging the measurements in the spiral notebook in the column beside the chassis stamping notes. The synchronizer rings were worn but intact. The gear teeth showed the particular wear pattern of a unit that had been used hard and maintained correctly. The input shaft bore the casting mark that identified it as original Muncie production. On day 10, Lily came to the shop and sat on her stool and watched Marcus measure the gear lash on the second speed cluster. "Why do you measure everything twice?" she said. Marcus did not look up from the dial indicator. "Because the first time tells you what you think," he said. "The second time tells you what's true." Lily considered this. "Is that why you're quiet a lot?" He looked up then. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." Ray, at the parts washer, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Carl Foss drove to Denton on day 14. He was 68 now, retired from his Detroit shop, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a man whose joints had opinions about the weather. He sat on the stool beside the bench, picked up the input shaft, turned it in his hands, and opened the battered reference binder he had carried with him from Detroit. He cross-referenced the casting date against the production records he had spent 40 years accumulating, then produced a written certification on his shop letterhead, co-signed by his former business partner, confirming that the unit was a numbers-matching M22 close ratio 4-speed, consistent with original ZL1 factory specification, with all principal components bearing dates and markings consistent with February 1969 assembly. The certification was presented at the same regional showcase where Paulson had declared the drive train scrap. Carl Foss read it aloud the way a mechanic reads a torque specification, without drama, with precision. When he finished, Crane looked at Paulson. The look was brief and without warmth. Paulson, standing slightly behind her and to her left, received it with the stillness of a man who has just understood that proximity to authority is not the same as sharing in it. Then Crane looked at Marcus and said quietly, "Derek was working from the inspection report. I should have had a second opinion before that statement was made publicly. I apologize for the characterization." Marcus said, "I understand." He did not say anything else. He picked up the certification from the podium table and folded it into the document sleeve with the build sheet and the Yanko letter. The letter had been folded into a manila envelope taped to the underside of the glove box behind the original owner's manual. And Marcus found it on day 6 when he was removing the dashboard assembly, and the envelope came loose and fell onto the transmission tunnel with a sound like a single quiet knock. He picked it up, looked at the tape, original masking tape, applied by someone hiding something deliberately, not carelessly, set it on the workbench, and finished what he was doing. He did not open it for another 40 minutes. The letter was typed on thin paper. the kind used by racing organizations in the late 1960s, when weight mattered even in correspondence. And it bore a letterhead Marcus recognized before he had finished reading the first line. The Penske Racing Organization, dated August 1969. The body of the letter referenced a chassis number, a Trans Am Series entry, and a delivery confirmation for the 1969 season. The chassis number matched the VIN on the cowl tag. Marcus set the letter down. He looked at Claire's photograph on the shelf. He had the feeling he sometimes had in the middle of a long restoration, the feeling that the car had been waiting, specifically for someone who would know what they were looking at. He did not tell Ray what the letter said until the following morning. Ray read it standing at the bench with his coffee going cold in his hand. When he finished, he set the letter down and said, "Huh." This was for Ray the equivalent of a standing ovation. Crane's public relations team provided the provocation on day 9 at a press briefing held to announce a new vintage acquisition program. A spokesperson, reading from prepared remarks, described the provenance claim attached to the Hale Camaro as unverifiable rumor, the kind of story that circulates around barn-find cars to inflate perceived value, and noted that no credible documentation had been produced linking the vehicle to any factory racing program. The spokesperson said this in front of journalists from Midwest Collector Car Journal, 2 of whom were recording. Marcus read the coverage at the workbench on day 11, set it down, and picked up his notebook. The work that followed was closer to archaeology than research. Marcus had a contact from his Detroit years, a retired motorsports photographer named Gene Albrecht, who had shot Trans Am races from 1967 through 1972 and had kept every negative, every contact sheet, and every piece of correspondence in a climate-controlled storage unit in Ann Arbor. Marcus called him on day 11. Gene drove to Denton on day 13 with 2 archival boxes and the careful manner of a man transporting something irreplaceable. He and Marcus spent the afternoon at the workbench, cross-referencing the contact sheets against the letter, matching the chassis number in the Penske letter against the chassis number visible in Gene's photographs of the entry documentation. The number matched in 3 separate photographs on 2 separate documents. Ray made coffee. Lily sat on her stool and did her homework, and periodically looked up at the 2 men bent over the photographs with the expression of a child who has learned that the important things happen quietly. On day 17, Marcus contacted the Penske Racing Archive directly. The archivist, Sandra Voss, confirmed within 48 hours that the chassis number appeared in the organization's 1969 Trans Am entry records, and produced a written confirmation on Penske Racing letterhead referencing the original entry documentation, the chassis number, and the delivery date. The confirmation was unambiguous. Broad Arrow Auctions retained to provide a preliminary valuation, based its estimate upward upon receiving the Penske confirmation. The revised figure, communicated in writing, was not a small revision. The regional showcase held its third segment on day 21, and this time the room was larger. Crane was present, with Paulson behind her and to the left. Sandra Voss's confirmation letter was read aloud by the Broad Arrow representative, who also read the revised valuation estimate in the flat, careful tone of a professional who understands that numbers speak for themselves. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Crane leaned toward her microphone, and her voice when she spoke was not the carrying voice she had used on the first Thursday in the garage. It was quieter and more deliberate, the kind of voice a person uses when they are choosing words with care because they understand the cost of the alternative. The statements made at our press briefing were based on incomplete information, she said. The provenance of this vehicle has been established. I was wrong to characterize it otherwise, and I want to say that directly. She looked at Marcus across the room. I'd like to make an offer, a serious one this time. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Lily, sitting in a folding chair beside Ray, with Babiscuit in her lap, watching Crane with the same calm attention she brought to everything she did not yet understand but intended to. He looked back at Crane. I'll think about it, he said. He folded the Penske confirmation into the document sleeve with the others and raked the sleeve in his jacket pocket. The aluminum block did not look like money. That was the first thing Marcus had understood about it. And the second thing he understood was that most people would never look closely enough to know the difference. Everything else had been verified now. The Hopo build sheet, the rock crusher transmission, the Penske provenance letter, and each had arrived at its authentication the same way, through patience and method, and the kind of unhurried attention that Marcus had learned not from any single teacher, but from years of work that had cost him something real. The block sat beneath the hood, gray and matte and unremarkable to anyone who had not been trained to read aluminum the way a surgeon reads a film. Derek Paulson arrived on a Wednesday, ahead of Crane, with his clipboard and the manner of a man who prepares the ground. He looked at the open hood, looked at the block, and said without preamble that an aluminum block in a car with this documentation history was almost certainly a replacement swap. Someone had opened the car and changed its heart, he said. And that kind of intervention broke the story for any serious buyer. A replacement block was a liability, not an asset. He said it with the same flat authority he had brought to the drivetrain assessment. And he said it in front of the camera crew that had followed Crane's team back to the shop for what her production staff was billing as a final documentation segment. Marcus listened. He did not argue. He said, "We'll see." And that was all. The work began on day one with cleaning, not restoration, not assessment, but cleaning, the kind that takes 4 hours and produces almost nothing visible to anyone watching. Marcus used a soft brush and a diluted solvent and worked the block's surface in sections no larger than his palm. And Ray documented each section with a Canon EOS R5 fitted with a 100 millimeter macro lens mounted to a small articulated arm. They had rigged from a length of threaded rod and a bracket from the harbor freight bin near the shop door. On day 4, they found the first anomaly, a stamp, partial, near the front face of the block, in a location that made sense for a standard production casting mark. Production marks lived in predictable places. This one did not, and that fact alone was worth sitting with. By day 7, they had the full impression, traced twice in pencil on paper and photographed 6 times under 3 different light angles. Marcus did not call anyone yet. He wanted to be certain before he made someone else certain. On day 11, Lily came to the shop after school and sat on the stool near the bench where Biscuit kept watch. And after a long time, she said, "Dad, how come you always look at things so long before you say anything?" Marcus thought about that for a moment. "Because looking is the hard part," he said. "What I'm saying is easy." She considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old receiving information she intended to keep, then held Biscuit against her chest and watched him work for another hour without asking anything else. On day 15, Marcus sent the photographs and the traced impressions to Pete Estes, Jr., an engine historian based in Bowling Green, Kentucky, who had spent 20 years cataloging pre-production and prototype aluminum block variants from the late 1960s GM racing program. Inside that narrow world, his word was the word. The reply came on day 18. Estes had identified the stamp as a pre-production casting mark, consistent with a small run of aluminum blocks produced in late 1968 for the Copo racing program, prior to the formal production sequence, the kind of mark that appeared on perhaps a dozen known examples. He attached a 4-page technical letter, signed and notarized, with comparative photographs from 2 other authenticated examples. Marcus read the letter twice. He set it down. He looked at the block. Then he called Crane. She arrived the following morning with Paulson a step behind. The letter was on the workbench, face up. Crane picked it up without asking and read it standing, and Marcus watched the quality of her stillness change as she read. Not dramatically, but in the way a room changes when someone opens a window. She set the letter down. "Pete Estes authenticated this personally," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Marcus said. She looked at the block for the long time, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost the carrying quality it had carried into the shop on that first Thursday. "I owe you a different conversation than the one I had last week," she said. "I was wrong about the block. I'd like to discuss an acquisition figure. A serious one." Marcus looked at the letter. He looked at the block. He thought about Claire, who had understood before anyone else what he was capable of seeing, and about Lily on the stool with Biscuit pressed against her chest, and about the 18 days of work that had produced in the end 4 pages of careful language from a man in Bowling Green who had spent his life learning to look. "It's not for sale," Marcus said. He said it quietly, without theater. Crane nodded once, slowly, and left. Paulson followed without speaking. The shop was very quiet. He drove home in the dark, through the flat grid of Denton streets, where the stoplights blinked yellow after 10, and the convenience stores threw long, pale rectangles of light across the asphalt. The truck cab smelled of solvent and cold air, and the faint sweetness of the fast food bag Lily had left on the floor 2 days ago that he kept meaning to throw away and hadn't. The porch light was on. It was always on when he came home late. He had started leaving it on after Claire died, not as a signal to anyone, not as a habit he had decided on, but because the first night he had come home to a dark house, he had stood at the door for a long moment before he could make himself go in, and he had never let that happen again. Lily was asleep. He stood in the doorway of her room long enough to hear her breathe, and Biscuit was on the pillow beside her, the rabbit's remaining ear bent at its familiar angle, and the nightlight cast a small amber circle on the ceiling that had been there so long it had become part of what he meant when he thought of home. He went back to the kitchen and sat down, and did not do anything for a while. What Victoria Crane had seen in the Camaro, in the end, was what she had been trained to see: category, condition, market position. She had been trained well. She was not careless or dishonest. She had simply looked at the car the way most people look at most things, which is to say, she had looked long enough to form a conclusion, and not long enough to find out whether the conclusion was true. Marcus had learned a different way of looking. Claire had called it his superpower once, laughing, in the kitchen of the apartment they had shared before Lily was born. And he had told her it wasn't a superpower. It was just time. The willingness to stay with a thing, past the point where most people walked away. She had said those were the same thing. He thought she had been right. The porch light held its shape in the window glass, a steady yellow square against the dark, and the house was quiet, and that was enough. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed.